Yeah, so for people just joining on Facebook, I'm with Jason Earle today. And let me tell you a little bit about him. He is a father of two young boys, an incurable entrepreneur, and indoor air quality crusader. He is the founder and CEO of the mold inspection company 1-800-GOT-MOLD and the creator of the Got Mold test kit. The realization that his moldy childhood home was the underlying cause of his extreme allergies and asthma led him into the healthy home business in 2002, leaving behind a successful career on Wall Street. Over the last 2 decades, Jason has personally performed countless sick building investigations, solving many medical mysteries along the way, helping thousands of families recover their health and peace of mind. He has featured or appeared on Good Morning America, Extreme Makeover Home Edition, The Dr. Oz Show, Entrepreneur, Wired, and more. That's awesome. You got on some pretty mainstream platforms there, Jason.
Thank you for having me, Bridget.
Yeah, I love it. Happy to be here. So, gosh, I feel like I've been talking about mold non-stop lately, which is great. But I wonder if we should just do sort of the mold 101. You're welcome to share more about your story and, yeah, maybe just explain to people a little bit more the big background of this mold industry.
Sure. Once again, thanks for having me, and Happy New Year. I
Yeah.
think I'll probably say that until March, but hopefully this is a
Hopefully, this is
glorious
our best year yet.
2022. Yeah, at least the best for the last few, right? So um, I'm optimistic. So, and I'm optimistic in part because, believe it or not, because of what I've seen with regard to what COVID has actually done for indoor air quality. The con air in general is this very difficult. I have two boys in diapers, as you said in my introduction, and I tried to explain to my 3-year-old what air is the other day, and it's kind of a funny conversation.
That's true, huh?
And so humans in general are we're just so far-sighted. In other words, we oftentimes, we're always cares what the neighbor. We don't clean up our own front doorstep. We're always worried about other people's. But also, we tend to think we're much more worried about what's going on with outdoor pollution than the indoor air, where we spend 90% of our time. There are many blind spots that we have, and air is one of them. And in part, I think it's just, the law of familiarity states that anything that you're exposed to long enough, eventually you take for granted. And breathing is probably one of the most profound examples of that, because if you do the math, you breathe 12, 14 times a minute. And if you do the math, that's about 20,000 times a day.
Wow.
20,000 times a day. Now, how many of those are conscious, thoughtful breaths? And you don't think about them very much unless you don't have enough of them, right? So air is one of those things that you really appreciate when you start to realize that there may be scarcity, or that it smells bad or tastes bad. At that point, it's too late. But yet, the thing is about air is that, unlike food and water and even shelter, which you can live without for quite some time, air, you've got 3 minutes. Yet it's the thing that you take most for granted, right? We don't get air hungry. We don't reach out for a breath, but we do for a bite. You don't get air thirsty. Yes, I guess you do in some cases, but most of the time that's because you've already got some pre-existing conditions. So my point is that what you have here with air being the most fundamental basic thing, the thing that we do 20,000 times a day, and yet it's the thing that we think about the least. And so what COVID has done is brought the subject to the forefront by showing that there are unseen hazards, and also, interestingly, the impact of air quality on health overall. So it's not just COVID, but people are realizing that unhealthy indoor air, whether it be moldy or unventilated, or maybe high VOCs, which we can talk about more as an adjunct to the mold conversation. Healthy indoor air or unhealthy indoor air makes you susceptible to other infections like COVID, right? So it's not
Yes.
just this one thing. We have to look at this in a holistic way, and I mean that in a WHOLE holistic way. So I think there's been tremendous. I think COVID has brought us a higher level of awareness about air quality, and for that, I think we ultimately will benefit tremendously, because behind food, food causes most chronic illness according to the CDC and many other research organizations. And if you do the math on it, between asthma, chronic sinusitis, there's evidence that mold and depression have a direct correlation. There's all sorts of evidence that show that mold exposure and indoor air quality affects your hormones and can cause weight gain and mess with your hunger hormones. There's all sorts of evidence that can contribute to obesity as well as other illnesses. And if you add it all up, air quality may cause as much or more chronic illness than food-related illness. So, but yet doesn't get that much press and attention. And yet we're seeing, I think, more awareness around this. And for me, for that, that's gratifying, because I think that as a nation and as a population, that will ultimately pay great dividends.
Yeah, I mean, I wish it were getting even more, but change and exposure. But it is at least got some. I'll put it that way. I'm sure with this whole COVID thing, there's just been a focus, too much focus on some things, and I think not enough on others, right? On like real root health pandemics that have been going on. And like I know I wrote about early on that areas with like higher particulate matter, COVID's like more intensified in those areas because it kind of attached to that. And man, I haven't seen that info anywhere. Like it's just not getting talked about enough, but I think at least some, right? I mean, so that's a start. And I think in my audience, they're super motivated about air. They're just like, what filter do I buy? What do I do next? And so I love to educate not just about filters, because it's also, about changing your filter and your HVAC system and cleaning often and how you clean and fragrance and stuff. So I think those are really great indoor air quality basics. I'm definitely on board. Yeah, so that's great.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about Mold 101. Let's start with the basics for your audience.
And anyone in the chat, if you want to say if you're kind of new to this topic or you're a long time on this topic and just came with a specific question, we'd just be happy to type in anytime. Just try to choose it. Send the comment to everyone.
So just in the most basic sense, we'll just get started with Mold 101. Mold is part of the kingdom fungi. Which is a very interesting kingdom indeed, not quite plant, not quite animal. And so typically people think about mushrooms, but of course mold and yeast are also fungi. And what makes molds particularly interesting is that they do their digestion on the outside of the cell. So mold spores are like seeds that float around in the air, and they are waiting for the optimum conditions for their particular species to grow and proliferate. And the job of mold in nature is to turn stuff into dirt. And so it is doing its job when it's doing it in your yard, turning sticks and leaves and things like that back into dirt. It is not doing its job when it's doing that to your house. And so that's where we have a problem. So molds in particular, this is the big common question we get. The most common question we get is, every house has mold. How do I know if I have a mold problem? And so the reality is that we don't look at mold as the problem. And this is the big sort of shift that needs to happen. And it seems very subtle, but it's extremely important. Mold is not the problem. Mold is the symptom. Moisture is the problem. And so if we can just adjust that when you have a mold problem, the real issue is you got a moisture issue. It's a lot like inflammation in the body, in the sense that if you got inflammation for some reason, you don't just take aspirin because you don't have an aspirin deficiency.
Right.
There's inflammation in the body for a reason. Acute inflammation, something that happened on an abrupt basis, needs treatment, and then it can rest. And then that you've treated that. Acute water damage is very similar. You treat it quickly and done within 48 hours, according to the EPA. If you dry a water damage issue within 24 to 48 hours, you can generally save yourself from having a mold problem. Water damage that goes on for more than 48 hours is a high risk. More than 72 hours, the industry standard says that's garbage, it's mold. Okay, so things get wet and stay wet for more than 3 days, or 3 days or more, just kiss them goodbye. As long as, within reason. So things that have high value and have sentimental value can sometimes be restored. But the bottom line is mold happens. Mold is a fact of life. It's a guarantee. It's up there with death and taxes. Stuff gets wet, it gets moldy. So the most important thing is that if something gets wet, you act quickly. And so in many ways, when you have a water damage issue, when you have moisture intrusion into your house, the musty smell, which has health impact, has an health impact in many ways. It triggers immune responses in sensitive people, allergic responses in some, inflammation in others. It's a trigger in many ways. The research on this is fascinating and emerging rapidly by the day. But the musty smell is actually your signal that something's wrong with your house. It's a sign that there's an imbalance, that there's a moisture issue. So instead of thinking that mold is the enemy, look at mold as your friend. It's communicating with you. It's letting your building is communicating with you, letting you know that there is something that needs attention. And so in many ways, that's the gift that mold gives you. But if you ignore that, just like if you ignore inflammation in your body and you just keep doing the same thing, ignoring that acute inflammation becomes what? Chronic inflammation. That chronic inflammation in the body is a disease on its own. It causes all sorts of other issues. Chronic dampness in the building is the same thing. It's a disease. And so chronic dampness is what makes people get chronically ill from mold exposure. People don't get chronically ill from mold exposure from a single exposure, except for the case of something called hypersensitivity pneumonitis, where they get a big lung full of stuff. It's also called it's like hayworker's lung, brewer's lung.
Yeah.
It's an occupational exposure, and it happens if you're raking your leaves, and you happen to be predisposed and you take a big lungful of stuff. So you can get sick from a single acute exposure, but it's highly unusual. Most people who get really sick from mold, who will end up in your care, for example, Bridgit, generally speaking, have had some sort of low-level chronic exposure. They lived in a basement apartment. They had some other issue going on, and they were exposed to, going back to the beginning, the musty odor. So or the other byproducts of mold growth, and their body shifts, things change within them, and you become hypersensitive to these things, and then oftentimes hypersensitive to chemicals as well.
Yes.
So unraveling that stuff is what you do, but getting people to the point where they recognize what they are empowered to do within their environment, and then getting clear of that is what we do. So in terms of what to do if you think you have a mold problem, I think that we can sort of go. People always ask if how do I know if I have a mold problem or not? And so the first thing I always suggest is that you should engage your senses before you engage a professional. So what that means is, before you start going on, even though we're sitting here on Facebook Live, before you go to Facebook for your answers, you really want to engage your senses. This is mold leaves clues, and these things sometimes they are subtle. But what I'm encouraging, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, I'm encouraging people to consider the building as an extension of your immune system. This is an interesting concept. So it's an exoskin or an exoskeleton. I mean, it is a basic human need, right? Shelter, air, water, and food. So what I'm suggesting is that we consider that this exoskin and this exoskeleton is something that we need to truly care for, so it cares for us. But you need to sometimes pause and engage your senses. And if you see something, smell something, or feel something, do something. So what are those things you might see? Any discoloration, any staining, any evidence of water damage or moisture, that's a big red flag. You want to investigate that. Smell something, the musty odor is pretty telltale, right? If you smell it, you probably have it. And if you feel something, that's where it gets a little murky, because you've got a wide variety of symptoms that mold causes. In fact, you can have 5 people in a moldy house and they'll all have 5 different symptom profiles. Some of them may not even feel sick at all, but they will feel better once the mold is removed, in my experience. So feeling something might be upper respiratory, might be typical hay fever type stuff. A lot of people end up with headaches, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating. Other people experience a lot of brain fog and cognitive impairment. In fact, one of the main things that people end up feeling is emotional dysregulation. Anger, rage, as well as depression are commonly reported from chronic mold exposure. So if you see something, smell something, or feel something, do something.
Yeah, I love those tips about the DIY. I was just on an interview, and people are always asking me, like, was it the Ermi? Like, what's the best test? And I say, first of all, are you a renter or are you owner is one question to ask. And yes, you can do these visual inspections, because people are often also asking me, well, how do I know when I move into a new house? And you don't have usually a lot of time, right? So you do have to be your own inspector. And if you're purchasing and you have an inspector, really turn them on to the things that you want them to check for. You can buy like I forget the name now, the humidity meter. It has some funny name. It's like hydrometer or something like that.
You can buy a moisture meter or a thermohygrometer.
Yeah. There you go. You know the words. So, there are some things you can do fairly affordably just to check some of the basics, especially if you're like kind of handy. I just encouraging people to come to our mold summit. I'm like, because you live in a building, you should know some of these things, because you I wasn't a good steward of my home when I found out I had mold. Our gutters weren't draining correctly. That was mostly the only. Oh, and we weren't running a dehumidifier in our basement. Those were like, and we ignored musty scent. But other than those three, we didn't know like the windows weren't installed correctly. Like most of our water damage was inside the walls, so we mostly didn't know. But there are a few things now that I'm like, I had no excuse to not be running a dehumidifier in that basement. And it's funny you say the musty odor, because when I first started to suspect mold, a naturopath was like, tell me about your house. Has anything changed? And I was like, well, there is a musty smell in our basement, and there was just some water intrusion. And sometimes it takes that person asking for you to like think about it. So I'm just happy for people to start to learn about home care, that, yeah, you need to take care of leaks right away. It's a big, big deal. Or, yeah, if you do see, signs of mold. I know another thing you can take, Jason, is like a little film, like underneath surfaces, like of chairs and stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, what you can do, well, first of all, one of the best tools you can have for finding mold is a bright flashlight. Just a very bright flashlight.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and you use it at an angle to surfaces. So in other words,
Okay.
you'll take it if you go to a wall in a basement, and this is a true pro tip. Anyone who's watching this is concerned that they may have mold in a basement, especially in an area where there might be condensation. So in other words, mold generally is produced either by a liquid water coming in or from high humidity. So in other words, liquid water comes in, leaks, floods, whatever, and then it dries out, and whatever it does, if it does, and then those damaged materials are water damage. Sometimes it's much more subtle though, where you have ambient humidity that rises gradually, like in a basement that doesn't have a dehumidifier, which is common in most of the 50 states where there are basements, or any of the states that have basements. And so this is much more insidious, because you'll get the odor, but you don't always have the visible mold. But what you do is you take a bright flashlight and you go down, you look underneath the bottom of especially wooden furniture, the bottom of drawers, pull a drawer out, like an old dresser drawer, and you look underneath that. On the bottom of stairs are also a common place. But you'd be amazed if you go on the side of dressers. You go to you look on the side of it, and you'll see the textures rise from the surface, and it's clearly not just dust; it's three-dimensional.
Yes.
And it'll look almost geometric in shape, and sometimes the colors are a little bit of a throw off too, because oftentimes this kind of colonization can almost be colorless, white, yellowish, very light, sometimes green. In some cases, absolutely gorgeous, lots of different colors. And I hate to say it, but you don't like to see it when you see it. But if you pause for a moment, the miracle of nature is wondrous. It's just not fun when it's growing on your stuff. And so in those cases, you obviously want to move very gingerly around those things, because you don't want to disturb them, because of course those are designed to break free and become airborne, and then you've got yourself more exposure. So,
yeah.
But yeah, no, listen, whether you're a renter or an owner, if you see something, smell something, or feel something, do something. The question is, if you're one or the other, you have very different options. A renter, you don't have the ability, oftentimes, whether it be budgetary or even permission, to bring in a professional and to invest in that property and to do those repairs. And so renters have a very different scenario. They have sometimes to be kind of heavy-handed. We recommend, we created a do-it-yourself test kit to answer that need. Our 1-800-GOT-MOLD inspection business is, our inspections are $1,000 or more. In order to have a qualified person come out and spend the number of hours that we do to do an assessment, you're going to have to pay at least that, plus lab fees. And so that is not for the average renter.
No.
And so it's unfortunate that healthy indoor air can be sometimes cost prohibitive. So my parents couldn't have afforded to hire me I created this company out of my own childhood struggle with asthma due to the moldy house I grew up in, and so we invested quite a bit to create a do-it-yourself test kit that would provide consumers with the same quality of testing that they get from a professional, but without the cost or hassle or aggravation associated with trying to find and hire one. And so you can look at that at gotmold.com. And part of the reason why I bring that up is actually we have a welcome page that we've created for your listeners, which is gotmold.com/Bridgit Danner. And we put on that page, we put an ebook that we created called How to Find Mold in Your Home. And also there's a 10% discount coupon for our test kit. And I'm not here to pitch the test kit. It's there as a resource for people who need it when they need it. But what I am pitching is actually the free ebook. Because anyone who's got questions about this, a lot of the stuff I talk about and sort of ramble on and talk too quickly saying is contained in this ebook. And so somebody actually nailed my feet to the floor once and wrote down the things that I was saying, and that's the byproduct. And so you've got a bunch of inspection checklists. If you scroll down further, you'll see that there you go.
Great.
There's a bunch of inspection checklists and FAQs and a bunch of good resources in there. We get really positive feedback about that. And so I encourage people to get that and take a cruise through that.
Great.
And of course, our test kit is all lab fees and shipping is included, and it's the best of breed product at this point. We work with MLab P&K, which is the #1 lab in the country, so you can be sure that the results are reputable and defensible. So that's
awesome.
that.
Okay.
And so if you want to have your house tested for mold, though, and you're concerned, or if you're a renter, do-it-yourself test kit is probably the best bet, because you can then use the data to at least get your landlord to take it seriously. In some cases, you need to do something, evoke something called the implied warranty of habitability. Renters, take note. There's actually an article on our website, which you can, if you go into the Learning Center, there's an article there called The Renter's Playbook. And I highly recommend that people, you can scroll down, maybe not be on this page. There. It may have to search for it.
Oh, this is a great blog. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're building this out. This is where we're putting some online courses up, free online courses about mold shortly. And so this is so we can put the Renter's Playbook in the show notes, I hope, because that would be, and anyone who wants to search for it, you can quickly find it. What we talk about there is something called the implied warranty of habitability. Landlords have a legal obligation to provide safe and clean housing, and that is not in the lease. That's why it's called an implied warranty of habitability. And it's not every state that has this legal doctrine. So you'll have to check with your local, with a lawyer in your area, or search and see if it's in place. But the bottom line is that if you have a medical condition, as many people listening to this will and do, then a safe and moldy house is neither safe nor clean. It's arguably not clean for anyone, but it's definitely not safe for someone who has a medical condition which mold either causes or aggravates. And so what people will do that have this problem will often document the problem, take a lot of pictures, collect samples to again document the presence of it, and then they will file for they'll pay their rent into escrow, and then and let their landlord know that when the property is restored to a normal healthy condition, they can get paid. And you can do that legally. You can do that very inexpensively. And there are resources, there are advocates out there that can help guide that process. And ultimately, if it doesn't work out, there's a function called constructive eviction in many states, where you can actually evict yourself, break your own lease, and not pay any penalties based upon the fact that the landlord is not providing a safe and clean environment. So there are tools out there that are free or very inexpensive that you can leverage with a little bit of data. But if you do he said, she said with renters and renter-landlord thing, it doesn't work. So do-it-yourself test kits like ours, for example, can be useful. And whether it holds up in court is dependent upon the judge. Some judges like it, some judges don't. And that really depends on what you're dealing with. But oftentimes it doesn't even get that far.
Yeah, that's a whole topic. I've been wanting to interview some attorneys. I haven't succeeded as yet, but I'm working on it. It's very specific. And I think we all have our little bit of prejudices and preferences. Me, as a practitioner, I'm like, please don't waste too much energy in like a legal battle. Like, you only have so much. You have your health forever. Not to say that is never worth engaging in. And I did research it a bit for the book. I didn't know some of these things you're sharing. But at least the benefit of a rental is you can move. And I know sometimes people don't want to move, but to me, it's like owning a home. It's a little different responsibility than renting. And, that's just my 2 cents. I'm really glad Jason's sharing these resources. I put it in the chat here, and we'll get it with the YouTube. But yeah, it's I know Jason too. I see rental agreements with like actually stating mold is your responsibility. You're in charge of your place. It's so BS. Because most of that stuff is structural. It's not like it's one thing if you overrun your bathtub, that's on you. But, mostly it's the roof is leaking and the landlord has never, maintained it properly. So it makes me mad. But yeah, as a practitioner, I'm like, please choose your battles. If that's a battle you really want to choose, okay. But, even I owned a home and I still moved. So, you know, and some people are like, well, you should have gotten more from your insurance or you should have sued the last owner. I was like, dude, we looked at like again, I only have so much energy going around. I already got to remediate my home, restore my health, move, like all these things. Like, let
Yeah, there's
me
no equity in anger, and you're not getting healthier with angry thoughts. And so if we're really on a path of healing, it's that kind of talk that's actually counterproductive. I don't suggest a legal battle. I suggest legal tools. You
Yeah,
can
definitely.
you
No,
can
know your rights.
you can solve a problem without being without battle, by
Yeah.
just simply documenting the facts, holding someone accountable, moving through your world and with equanimity, and simply stating that this is not clean or safe. I can't live here. And by doing this, you can do it without having to deal with a potential legal battle where you get sued for breaking a lease. That's actually the best part, is that you can actually
Interesting.
reduce
Okay.
by you can break your lease without actually being without having liability if you do it correctly. People who own a home, you have a different story. Your home is your health. Your home is your health. You cannot have. I've done thousands and thousands of assessments, and you walk into a house, and I can tell if people are healthy. I can walk into a house without the people there, and tell if the people that are living there are healthy, without even meeting them. And then when you meet them, you can see. It's just, it's hard to say, to put your finger on it, but you can see what a healthy home produces, and you can see what unhealthy homes produce. And it's just one of those things that, after seeing thousands and thousands of cases, that there's a consistent pattern there. You are the accumulation of what you eat and breathe,
Right.
and what you think. And if you're living in a place where, by the way, indoor air quality, really important point. Indoor air quality is not just indoor air; it's outdoor air that comes in. And then it's the production of things that are done indoors, or the release. So we're bringing in furniture from Pottery Barn or from China, and and all the
100%.
VOCs, and then the cleaning products and all this stuff. We are killing ourselves with VOCs. We don't. Thank goodness we don't smoke anymore. As a culture, that's been reduced to a negligible degree. But the point, but we are doing as much, if not worse, by infusing all these chemicals, and then also ignoring mold problems. Our houses are so tight now for energy reasons. And what they do is they create this rebreathing. Imagine if you just kept rebreathing the same air in a balloon, you'd die very quickly. Well, we're doing that to ourselves on a larger basis, because air comes in, and the same exposure that you would have outdoors, you have between 4 and 7 times more exposure to that same air indoors, because you're rebreathing it. So outdoor air pollution gets magnified indoors. It's crazy. And so it's very important that you run air purifiers. It's very important that if you have VOCs in your house, you do things like get an ERV or HRV, which is an energy recovery ventilator or heat recovery ventilator, to bring in fresh air from outside and to push out or purge the stale air. And this is especially important in very cold climates, like where I'm currently living, which is in Minnesota, where outdoor air coming in is you don't want to just bring it in unfiltered or without doing a heat exchange. And so these things are extremely important, but it's not just if you have a mold problem. And so I'm speaking to everybody here. If you live in buildings and breathe air, this is for you.
Yeah.
And so air purifiers, if you have a refrigerator in your house and you've got electricity and running water, you should have an air purifier. And you should not just have one, you should have them in every area where you spend more than a few hours a day. And in the basements, you should be running dehumidifiers and monitoring that with the humidity gauge.
Yeah.
You shouldn't modify what you don't quantify. And if you're humidifying, adding moisture to your kid's room or to your room, you should have a humidity gauge in that room. If you're dehumidifying, you should have a humidity gauge in and around those areas to see what you're actually accomplishing. And the goal with humidity is to keep it between 40 and 60% throughout the year, keeping in mind that it will move quite rapidly. Below 40%, you'll have a lot of discomfort. You could become quickly dehydrated, and actually make yourself susceptible to infections. Your mucous membranes dry out. So below 40% is not good. And by the way, these are the ASHRAE guidelines, which is the American Society for Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. And 60% is the high end, and that's where you start to see the potential for condensation to develop, where you'll have water activity that can contribute to mold growth, as well as dust mites and other allergens. So it's not just mold that we're worried about with high humidity. Once you have a humidity issue, the mold grows, and dust mites come along, and then you end up with all sorts of other miniature insects, so to speak, and then you end up with other pests, and then ultimately it's a pool party. Everyone's invited, but you know, as soon as you have a water problem, it's like a message goes out to the neighborhood. Yeah. Everybody comes. All these uninvited guests showed up, and all of those guys in aggregate contribute significantly to poor indoor air quality. And it all begins with one thing: it's moisture, right? So that's the only thing that we can really control in this whole mess is really the moisture, and then the most important thing is that you move quickly.
I'm so glad you came on. This is just such a great explanation. I'm definitely going to share this interview because we're just covering a lot of things that people have questions about. I want to answer some of the questions and speak to some of the comments in the chat. So let me go back a bit. So your kit, Barbara is asking, it's an air sample or it's agar plates or both?
Good question. So so our kit uses spore traps. And so these are spore traps. These cassettes are the industry I shouldn't say the industry standard. They are the most common form of air sampling done by professional inspectors. And so air is drawn through. If you were to hire a professional right now to come and test your house, 9 out of 10 or more would pull these out after they've done the physical inspection, looked around and figured out where they want to collect samples. They would pull out a professional air sampling pump, which is a device that draws air through these cassettes. You put on a tripod. Many of your listeners will have seen this. This pulls air through for 5 minutes, and it collects the particles that are suspended in air on a glass slide inside. They are then sent to a laboratory for analysis. So instead of the professional pump, which is expensive, calibrated, delicate, which costs $1,000 or so, we created one that is battery powered. It duplicates a professional air sample exactly, same airflow rate. It's been tested by numerous different groups, and so it replicates a professional air sampling pump exactly. And so our kit comes with the supplies for either 1, 2, or 3 rooms, or 1, 2, or 3 areas. To average size rooms. So for a very big room, let's say like a basement that might not have walls, you might want to collect more than 1 sample in that room, so to speak, and you call those areas. But in any case, it's 1, 2, or 3 rooms. And then once you buy the kit, you can then you can keep the pump. In fact, we don't take the pumps back. We encourage people to either share them with a friend or to keep them, and then you can reorder supplies. And the retesting kits are $50 less, so you end up being able to share, or for whoever you share it with. The agar plates, I must mention, are what we lovingly call junk science. So there are the vast majority of the products out there. The reason we created a mold test kit is because there wasn't one that was worth recommending. And we get, my company's called 1-800-GOT-MOLD. We get a lot of phone calls, and when people call us, they all call us. You're about like, wrong thing. Number. We know what people want, and so we know what's not out there, and because we know what is. And so we created this purely to answer demand, purely to fill a need, and that is for a simple product that does what the professional testing will do without having to deal with someone who's going to try to sell you remediation or not give you a proper interpretation, or just deal with finding a guy or gal who's qualified that you feel comfortable with. That's going to also to use a good lab. We have the best lab in the country for a fraction of the cost. So, but the Petri dish test kits are scientifically invalid. Hey, let's talk about Ermi for a minute too. Can we talk about Ermi for just a quick minute?
Sure. I will get to some other questions, you guys, so don't worry.
Okay, really quickly. Well, maybe I should put a pin in it. Somebody might ask about Ermi.
Ermi's a long one. Yeah. We'll put a pin in that for another interview. But so now we have this option. I'm glad I know it, because I unfortunately I didn't know it right before I wrote my book, Jason. But we'll get it next time.
Second edition.
Here's a new, something new that I didn't know about. So it's fantastic. Kirsten asked, if you want to save something from moldy environment, can you use an ozone machine in a small room to get rid of mold on the items, or do you really have to throw them away?
Okay, so I'm rarely the bearer of good news.
Me too. I'm with you.
Yeah. So this is what I do. I either talk people down from the ceiling, or I break bad news. And in this case, ozone machines are just not advised in most cases. There are very few exceptions, and I can't even think of one off the top of my head. But I'm open-minded to the possibility. The reality is that mold growth on items is different than mold spores settled on items. And this is a very important distinction, and it's a great question for that reason. So if you've got something that's moldy, mold is growing on it, and it's hard, non-porous, right? Glass, metal, plastic, wood, certain kinds of wood, especially finished, that stuff can be cleaned, right? What you're generally talking about, these kinds of questions, if Kirsten if I'm correct, is she's asking about porous items, things that are like clothing, upholstered items, things that might have maybe even paper or sentimental things that might have some other value. Those things are unfortunately generally to be disposed of if they've got actual mold growing on them. If they were in a moldy space and they have mold spores have settled on them. So let me to break back. The industry standard is called the IICRC S520. And it's parallel to the S500 mold damage standard. And so they break down the indoor environment into 3 different categories: condition 1, 2, and 3. Condition 1 is normal, where there's mold spores but no growth, or even conditions conducive to growth. Skipping over condition 2, condition 3 is where you got actual growth on a surface. That's the stuff that you would wipe off or HEPA vacuum, right? You got actual growth on the surface, or materials that are porous, you would throw them away. Condition 2 is where it's tricky, and this is where there's sometimes professional judgment, but more often than not, if you when in doubt, throw it out. Condition 2 is settled spores. It's a high concentration of fungal matter on a surface that has accumulated from a mold problem somewhere else in proximity. So does that make sense to you? So
Yeah.
So that is why mold remediation involves HEPA filtered vacuum cleaners, air scrubbers, damp wipes, because while you're doing all this rip out, your stuff is settling out of the air, and then you're cleaning that. That's condition 2. Condition 2 is just contamination. So making the distinction between putting something in a room that's got ozone and trying to ozonate it because it's got mold growth on it versus trying to kill spores. First of all, killing spores doesn't actually get rid of, no matter what people say, you're still leaving behind fungal matter.
Yes.
And you're still you're ultimately, mold remediation is about removal. It's not about killing. You do not need to use chemicals. You do not need to use ozone. There is no killing mold. There's no need to do it. It doesn't help anything. In fact, it only leaves behind a residue. So my suggestion would be to take the ozone machine and put it on the side, and clean the items to the best of your ability. And if you can't clean them to the best of your ability and you still feel as if they're causing you, if you're sensitive to them, then you have to dispose of them.
Yeah, I'm the bearer of the bad news too. But again, I did it. Like everything in my house is now in like 2 Tupperware tubs. That's all I have left. I saw some like joke on Instagram, like if you've been through mold, like you've got tubs because like you're storing things temporarily, or you're keeping some important documents or whatever. But I don't open that really. And there's enzyme treatments now that professionals can do or you can buy, but I don't think it's so simple either. Like really for those porous things out, and then you can maybe use the enzymes like as one of the last kind of layers of cleaning. But sometimes like with wood, you've got to like sand it before you enzyme it. I personally, Jason, like put some wood furniture in storage and could not get back to it. I think wood is a lot more questionable than, even if it's got a finish. I think those are hard to recover. Do you really want to be sanding it down and refinishing it after it was in a moldy house? Like just let it go. So yeah,
it's a matter of personal judgment at that point, right? Some people can be around it and some people can't. But I agree. I tend to say you err on the side of caution, and when in doubt, throw it out. But I also am not a maniac about this stuff, and I do think that you have to make the distinction between something that was in a moldy space versus something that has mold growth on it. And a lot of times people find themselves in this loop because a lot of the mold trigger will cause people to have responses. I mean, if I eat chicken that I think is a little too pink that I've cooked, I sometimes feel nauseous from that. And I know because I'm nervous that I might get sick. I don't get sick from it, but there's a psychosoma loop that my fear response kicks in potential nausea for this chicken that I just ate. And the same thing happens oftentimes with mold, where people become concerned about this and they start to find themselves creating more tension in their life surrounding objects that may have had
Right.
been in a moldy space. And so,
Why are you going to be paranoid and keep it and be paranoid?
And so there's two things. First of all, if you're worried about it, get rid of it so there's not something. The other thing is that oftentimes these objects, if they're properly cleaned, are in HEPA vacuumed, wiped down, especially the porous stuff. Give it time. Get your air purifiers running. Get your rest of your stuff under control. Get the humidity under control. Get rid of the carpet in your house. Do the other things that are super important for your air quality. And then you can worry about those. But I think the most important thing is when in doubt, throw it out. And also you can put stuff on the side and revisit it. A lot of people will put stuff in like you said, in totes, and they'll put them in the garage or in a space, ideally climate controlled, where they can revisit this, because I've also put stuff in totes to do that and come back and it's moldier because I put it in the space that I didn't understand before I got in the mold business. Really what was going on.
Yeah,
I'm also a customer here too, So,
storing stuff in the garage. These are just like important papers, but we put stuff in a whole storage unit to revisit, and we didn't keep any of it in the long run. But at least it gave us a little bit of like, I don't know, little less grief and trauma in the moment to be like, hey, here's some stuff we wish we could like revisit. So let's open up the storage unit in a few months and reevaluate. So you got queued up to do an Ermi comment, so you're in luck.
I'm not sure. So here's the rest of my bad news. Ready? Don't use Ermi.
Okay, wait, let me tell the story first.
Okay.
Amy says the daughter and her roommates in a college apartment with mold. Very common, Amy. Her daughter has the mold gene. Very affected roommates are also sick. Starting battle with landlord. Hard for girls to move. Ermi, she corrected and said is 14.75.
Okay. This could be the long one. I'm going to do my best. I tend to be long-winded if you didn't notice. So, because there's a lot here with these things, unpacking this can sometimes be a little bit complicated. But so, first of all, please get in touch with me about your children, about your, is it your son or your daughter?
Daughter.
The daughter's dorm room. We are doing a piece right now on college mold. We're writing some articles, doing some research on this. We're going to do a blog series actually on this. And we're going to offer our test kits on a deeply discounted basis to college kids, especially if they'll post about it. Once they get the results, we'll give them for free, because we want to raise awareness about this. They're currently they're worse off than renters, because they can't get a professional on there in to check these things out. And they're only stuck with things like Ermi, which is, the good news is a lot of people think Ermi is valid, so that might actually get some people's attention. But Ermi stands for environmental relative moldiness index. It's a clumsy series of words, and it was designed as a research tool by the EPA, and it was originally based upon it's 36 molds, and 26 of them, I think 10 of them are water damage and 26 are common. And the bottom line is that those 36 molds were chosen based upon a very small, some 20-something home research study that was done by Steve Vesper of the EPA many moons ago. And they chose those molds because there was they confirmed mold presence, and then they sampled and they found those molds, and they said, well, this is the profile for a moldy house, and then this is the profile for a non-moldy house based upon 20-something homes. This is a tiny sampling. And they collected the dust in a compound sample, which is a no-no in science in my world, where you collect samples from two different sources and then combine them and then try to do a diagnostic from that. Doesn't make sense. It'll be like collecting samples from two different humans and then trying to say which one's sick. And running them together and saying which one's sick. It doesn't make sense. So this Ermi sample calls for you to collect a dust sample using any vacuum cleaner, apparently. So the volume is in question. Less science by the minute. And then you collect the sample in your living room and in your bedroom. And then it uses something called PCR, which is a technology that's used to detect COVID. It's a genetic targeting technology that only finds what you're looking for. Keep in mind that there are over 100,000 species of mold that have been identified and described. About 1,000 commonly found indoors that show up on our charts on a regular basis. And so there are 36 that were selected here to somehow represent the totality of all mold problems. And so it's like going into a field and going in with a microscope, a giant field with a microscope. It's a very clumsy way. And bottom line is, it gives you a numerical output, and people assign the whether that house is safe or not based upon the output of that one particular test. And if Ermi wasn't such a bad test to begin with, the whole thing, I would say that would maybe be okay, but it's a bad test, and it's also a bad idea to, even with our test, any one test, there's no test that's actionable by itself. There's no single test that is actionable by itself. I don't care if it says you've got Stachybotrys in every single sample. It's not actionable by itself. You still need to have the context of the building conditions. You still need to actually have source diagnostics done. Where's the moisture coming from? Was that mold just brought in from a moldy box that was literally brought in from somewhere else and dropped in the middle of the living room? The source may not be the house. So a test by itself is not actionable. But Ermi tests, unfortunately, have a particular proficiency for false positives, because what it's doing is collecting all the dust that's settled. Old buildings, especially in colleges, have a lot of old dust and a lot of accumulation of stuff that comes in from outside. And news for it, even in healthy buildings, all the spores come from outside. So if over 100 years at a university, you got a lot of settled spores. A lot of these windows are open all these bucolic tree-lined, universities. There's a lot of concentration of fungal spores, and Ermi doesn't calculate or what they call normalize for the for the age of the building or for the cleanliness of the building. And so there's a humongous disparity. If you sample a brand new house versus an old house, and they both are mold free, you'll find that the old house almost always shows up 4 or 5 times higher. And it's just because of an accumulation. It's called sink effect. So Ermi is scientifically invalid. And I will prove it, because if you Google EPA diagnostics or EPA building diagnostics Ermi, the EPA put up a page that says, don't use this test for building diagnostics. They even said so.
Right.
They developed it. They own the patent, because it's being used as an absolute, and people are taking action, severe action, moving, selling houses, relocating, lawsuits, all this stuff based upon something that is truly, completely invalid.
Yeah, people will send me their Ermi to look at, and I'll look at it, but basically I have to explain why it's not that useful to me and stuff like that. So yeah, and I love you're admitting it's not just one sample. I know that Jason's offering something new, quote unquote, but realize when probably the Ermi was used because there weren't a lot of other options, right? So just like with lab testing, if you go back to health testing 20 years ago, a lot of this stuff wasn't available. Thank God we have it available now, because just testing wasn't as good. You could literally not test the body for mycotoxins until they invented that test. It was just blood markers for inflammation. Is that telling you have mold? No. So there's been a lot of progress. I'm super thankful for it. Yeah, Amy's saying it was an apartment, but yeah, I think just college living is generally a problem. I went to visit my sister-in-law when she was going to Harvard, and I was like, you couldn't pay me to live in some of these dorms. They're so ancient. I'm just like, forget it. So yeah, I think it's an important area to look at. I'm glad you're writing a blog on it. I think it's something that we need to, as parents, be aware of when we send our kids away. So yeah, I had mushrooms growing in the floor of my college house I lived in, and my friend was just interviewing me, and she's like, yeah, I had this mold spot on the wall, and I would just spray it with bleach every week. And I'm just like, does everybody have a mold story who's been to college? It's so bad.
Yeah, I think so. And I honestly, it impacts people's ability to learn. It really, truly, I think it's taking away a lot of our productivity. I think mold in schools, college, middle schools, all schools, K through 12, is a massive problem, especially affecting the poorer areas, because school budgets are so constrained and they avoid the subject. You're not even allowed, if you go to a school maintenance conference they won't let you talk about mold. If you email someone and mention mold, they will literally never respond to you. It's like doctrine. But I want to mention something here, because Amy just said many mold experts say to use Ermi. This is true. many of the mold doctors recommend Ermi. I spoke recently at the Real Time Labs conference, their last conference, to all the doctors who use the Real Time Labs mycotoxin test. And my talk was, stop using Ermi. And half of the people hated me, and half of the people there applauded.
I'm applauding.
It was incredibly divisive, and I made a lot of enemies that day without even really intending to do so. But the bottom line is that you do it because doctors don't want to think about those things. And Ermi is PCR, and it's got EPA, and it's got all the validity at first blush that doctors would need to have in order to think that they understand the technology. The reality of it is that if they look a little bit closer, if they'll take the time to look at it, it's not a valid test. And so part of our mission here is, I don't care if people use our test or not, just stop using Ermi. It's inflammatory. At the very least, it creates so much fear and confusion. There's nothing valid about it. It will only make you crazy.
Yeah, I know. I acknowledge it's confusing, Amy. I wish it could be different. I mean, look at the whole world of healthcare, though, right? Like, one person's going to tell you to vaccinate. No, there's not. This is like, you do kind of have to find your own way amongst all of it. And I think in another 20 years, it'll be a very different conversation. So again, kind of like do your own education, think about your budget and your situation. I'll let this be the last question because we really went a long time, but Pamela was asking if white mold is covered in the air sample you do.
I don't believe so. We don't do a speciation, and the reason. So I'll make an important distinction here. So the settling plates, there's two different ways that you can identify mold. You can identify it once it grows and colonizes, which takes time. And also culturing mold you sometimes miss species in doing that. But anyway, that's the way that they used to do it, where they would collect spores using something called an impactor onto a petri dish. They still use the petri dishes for these sampling plates that they sell at Home Depot and Lowe's that are scientifically valid. But that's the culturing of mold is where you'd end up getting a species because you'd be able to truly identify it. The kind of samples that we collect we're identifying that we're picking up the spores, and oftentimes the species are not identifiable. They're identified at the genus level, one notch up. Okay.
Gotcha.
And so for example, we find Penicillium. There's about 900 or so, if I'm not mistaken, at this point, and Aspergillus, roughly the same. And so we don't make the distinction between those two, even though there are very important distinctions between them in many ways. So the point is that this is really to use as a screening tool. As most tests should, by the way. One of the things I guess I'll leave with this. Let's not worry about the species of mold, okay? This is extremely important. People want to talk about the toxic mold and the black mold. I've got this mold or that mold. It doesn't matter what mold you have. The remediation's the same. The treatment's the same. Now, people will talk about detoxing, and maybe if you know what kind of things that you need to chelate or carry out, with binders, that's a different conversation. In terms of your house, the type of mold you have, all it does is tell you really the kind of water damage you have. And so when we see different kinds of mold, we look at it from a curiosity of what happened to this house. We get to see that this is a chronic condition based upon the species that showed up. We get to see that there's a particular type of mold that might indicate rot, which means a really significant long-term problem. And so I look at mold species on a mold report as sort of a forensic thing, as opposed to a diagnostic, or as opposed to a prescriptive mechanism. Does that make sense? So I look at it from more forensic. This is what happened in the building, as opposed to what we're going to do based upon those results. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and Amy's giving an argument, but I'm going to kind of side with Jason, Amy, because I see some of this too. And I love when I talk to a new expert and something I've determined on my own, just with my human brain, I'm like, oh, we're in agreement. Because remember what he said, the mold is a symptom of the problem in the building. The problem is you're in a water damaged building, or you have moldy
Don't chase
things.
species. Don't chase species, because the same thing happens with allergy tests and allergy shots. And it's the same narrow database that you're talking about. And what people don't realize about mold is that if you were to create an environment conducive to growth right now, let's say on your wall in your living, and you were to look at these and do a freeze frame, grab a picture of it, zoom in, identify all the colonies, the species, and then keep that condition present so that the moisture is present. And then you do another picture in 24 hours, another picture in 24 hours, and you keep doing that. What you'll be surprised by, Amy, is that the species change over time. And there's sometimes there's an incredible diversity until eventually one of them will generally dominate and take over. And that's the result of the chronic dampness. And that's the chronic dampness that brings in the quote unquote toxic mold. And the reason it's toxic mold is because it creates toxins to kill the other molds. This is chemical warfare on a microscopic basis. We get caught in the crosshairs. So they're killing each other with the toxins and then becoming dominant. But the point is that there's this incredible diversity that occurs. And so when people get into trying to test for a species, I'm allergic to this one. Is this in the sample? First of all, the samples we take are very small. They're not meant to say what's in your house. They're meant to identify potential for, or to identify the presence of a problem, and then to confirm whether or not it's been corrected. So don't get caught on species. This is again, missing, you're missing the mark here. It's always about the moisture. If you fix the moisture, you don't need antimicrobials. If you fix the moisture, you don't worry about the species. If you fix the moisture, there's so many things take care of themselves. It really comes down to just that. This is not follow the money, follow the moisture.
And it's the same in the body. So I see some comments coming through, and I'll try to keep it brief. I think it's the same in the body. Like, now that we know certain binder goes to a certain mycotoxin, that's cool. It's cool to know some things about your genes, but I can tell you that a lot of the stuff that we do to detox is the same stuff, right? We use the sauna, we exercise, we breathe deeply, we get an air filter on our home. I usually use a variety of binders because whatever you peed out the day of your test is just what you peed out the day of your test. These have life cycles. You know, there's a lot of stuff we still don't know about those fields. So like, let's do a general detox. I don't think like one species is going to escape us, or one type of mycotoxin. Not so much. Like, I just don't really, again, I think it's cool. I think we're learning things, but we don't have all this down. And when we get, too focused on one little thing, I think it kind of makes us crazy. And it's, I'm not judging at all, because I know all this stuff is coming out in our whole community, and like, that's why, these questions are coming up. But I think as we learn new things, we get excited. And then sometimes we have to step back and be like, oh, but is this really going to change like our approach or not? So.
Well said. Many times these tools for diagnostics and stuff like that are exciting because they give us a different perspective. They're not always as useful as we learn them to be later on. And we tend to get kind of narrow. This is in many cases, this is really about doing less, just being more aware, and allowing the body to heal. And also just the first step in detoxing, in my experience, is stop toxing.
Yeah, right? That's your job, Jason.
Yeah, but seriously.
It is.
Stop the toxing and
reduce the load.
And so the first thing to do is stop the moisture. And also, I must say, for everyone who's listening to this, I'm very much aware of the fact that this is confusing. And part of the confusion is that if you're dealing with a mold problem, you're cognitively impaired in many cases. And so give yourself a little bit of slack, because people tend to be very hard. Human nature, I mean, it's just the human condition. We're hard on ourselves. If anybody ever heard the things that we said to ourselves, they'd lock us up. The crazy thing is that we all do it. And yet at the same time, when we're mold affected, it gets even worse, and it's murkier and it's heavier, and you feel it's just so heavy. But give yourself some patience with this stuff. It's hard, it's confusing. A lot of this is counterintuitive. There are resources out there. We're a resource. I created Got Mold, not to sell stuff, but to help people. And we happen to sell stuff to help people measure this. But at the end of the day, the answers are emerging. There's a lot of junk out there. You have to be an informed consumer. It's caveat emptor. Most of the professionals out there are unqualified. So you have to ask good questions. We have articles about how to hire professionals on gotmold.com at the Learning Center, if you want to go poke around in there. But yeah, and if anybody wants to get in touch, you can always go to gotmold.com. Down at the bottom, we have a field you can just ask questions there. You can also go to our Facebook page and ask questions there, and we'll answer them publicly if you've got something interesting to ask, and for the benefit of everyone, we'd love to have that conversation there too.
Perfect. Well, I'm so glad we connected, Jason. Like this was perfect. You're just expanding my knowledge and obviously my community's knowledge. I'm really going to promote this on the YouTube because I can just be like, go watch, right? Go watch this. Like, it's going to answer a lot of your questions. So, and you guys, I put the link to the guide in here. It's like a 43-page guide. I just opened it. So, I know you've got a job and now you've got mold and you got a lot, but it is worth it to educate yourself so that you do make good decisions as you go through the process step by step. So, thank you so much, Jason, for everything you're doing in this space. And we're definitely going to keep in touch.
Yes, thank you for having me, Bridgit. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.